Okay, let's talk about what's been happening in Venezuela. Now, of course, last week there were elections, presidential elections, and the short version of the story is that the sitting president, Nicolas Maduro, won the elections. Now, that would have been a very short, very uninteresting story if it wasn't for the allegations of election fraud. Now, these allegations are coming from the opposition in Venezuela. Duh. Very surprising that the opposition would accuse the sitting powers of committing election fraud. But anyway, the exit polls seem to show that the opposition was ahead by quite a margin, but then in the results, Nicolas Maduro all of a sudden won the election, so they claim that he must have rigged the elections somehow. Now, also from abroad, these concerns were voiced by especially the United States, of course. So let's listen to what Antony Blinken had to say about this.
We've seen the announcement just a short while ago by the Venezuelan Electoral Commission. We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people. It's critical that every vote be counted fairly and transparently, that election officials immediately share information with the opposition and independent observers without delay, and that the electoral authorities publish the detailed tabulation of votes. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
Right, so basically Antony Blinken is accusing Venezuela of not having a very transparent election process. Now, let's take a look at what Fiorella Isabel had to say on X. By the way, here she is responding to something that Donald Trump said, which was very much in line with what Antony Blinken said. And she says, Venezuela has voter ID, fingerprint ID, one-day voting at one designated location, a paper ballot trail, electric voting machines not connected to the internet, multiple audits and same-day results. US elections have none of that. So basically, she is pointing out that Venezuela probably has a much more robust election process than the US. So what Antony Blinken said very much reeks of hypocrisy. Now, of course, I don't know for sure what happened here because I haven't counted all the votes myself. I haven't talked to everyone in Venezuela and asked them how they voted and then checked if everything was done correctly. So I don't know. But that's the thing. No one does. Because events like this, so an election, presidential elections in a country of almost 30 million people, you're working with numbers that are so big that it's virtually impossible to check. And that makes it very susceptible to fraud, very susceptible to election fraud. But it also makes it very susceptible to false claims of election fraud. In that regard, it's very similar to something like allegations of sexual misconduct, which seems to be the weapon of choice for the establishment in many organizations. So whenever some opponent seems to be becoming too powerful, too big, and they want to get rid of them, many times you see that all of a sudden these people are accused of some kind of sexual misconduct. Now, don't get me wrong, sexual misconduct unfortunately is a real thing, it happens, but the allegations of sexual misconduct also seems to be the weapon of choice for the establishment to get rid of opponents. And the reason for that is because it's so very difficult to prove that it's not true. It's also very difficult to prove that it's true, but that's not so much a problem for the accusers as it is for the accused, because the allegations alone are enough to usually destroy someone's reputation. So that's why this is such an effective weapon. Very similarly, allegations of election fraud are very difficult to disprove. So I may have my suspicions, but I don't know for sure what happened here. But there are some things that we do know. Now, first of all, we have to understand that Venezuela is a much more important country than probably most people think. And that's mainly because of oil. Venezuela has the biggest oil reserves in the world. Let me say that again. Venezuela has the biggest oil reserves in the world, and that of course makes it a target. And we know how much the US government loves some oil. Now, speaking of the US government, roughly since the Second World War, it seems like the US government has adopted a kind of behavior where it seems to believe that the United States is the most important country in the world. The US should decide everything, they should control everything, and anyone that dares to go against that and do their own thing, and anyone that in any way poses any kind of threat to the hegemony of the US very much runs the risk of being eliminated. Now, throughout the years, the US has exhibited some means by which they try to submit others to their will. Now, one of them, of course, is economic sanctions. So the US has been sanctioning many countries across the world, as they've been doing now with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, also African countries, and also some Latin American countries, including Venezuela. The US has been sanctioning Venezuela for many years now. Now, another big thing in the arsenal of the United States is so-called regime change operations. And they can do that by force. So the United States has been linked to many assassinations across the world, also assassinations of world leaders. They've also been linked to many wars, of course. For example, Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, Libya, former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan. The list goes on and on and on. But what the US really has specialized in is what we call covert regime change operations. So that's basically secretly getting rid of the sitting government of some foreign country. And how that may work is like this. So they kind of infiltrate in a country. They very strategically place some assets in that country. They invest a lot of money in some NGOs and media outlets. They spread a lot of anti-government propaganda. By the way, US is the king of propaganda. When you hear propaganda, most people will probably think China, Russia, North Korea. Well, the US is the absolute master of propaganda, and there's no one else that even comes close to the sophistication that the United States has. Now, and then they usually cause some unrest in that country, of course, blaming the sitting government, and then all of a sudden they somehow present the solution, and the solution is usually getting rid of the sitting government and replacing it with a government that happens to be very sympathetic to US policies. And they do that without the public really knowing that they were actually behind all of this. So that is a covert regime change operation. And they've been doing that across the world, and they've also been trying to do that in Venezuela for many years now. And they're not even quiet about it, they're openly saying it. Listen to what Senator Chris Murphy said a while ago.
We just have to be clear that our Venezuela policy over the last year and a half has been an unmitigated disaster. And if we aren't honest about that, then we can't self-correct. We have to admit that our big play, recognizing Guaido right out of the gate and then moving quickly to implement sanctions, just didn't work. It didn't. And it's just been an embarrassing mistake after mistake since. First, we thought that getting Guaido to declare himself president would be enough to topple the regime. Then we thought putting aid on the border would be enough. Then we tried to sort of construct a kind of coup in April of last year, and it blew up in our face when all the generals that were supposed to break with Maduro decided to stick with him in the end.
So again, they've been trying to get rid of the Maduro government for many years now, and they've been trying everything. And by the way, this whole thing about the elections of last week being rigged started because some exit polls seemed to show that the opposition was ahead by quite a margin, and then all of a sudden Maduro still won the election. So there must have been a rigging going on of the election. Now, take a look at this article from Geopolitical Economy Report. So, US government-linked firm is source of exit poll claiming Venezuelan opposition won election. Venezuela's opposition and US media outlets claim there was fraud in the July 28 election based on an exit poll done by US government-linked firm Edison Research, which works with CIA-linked US state propaganda organs and was active in Ukraine, Georgia, and Iraq. Now, isn't that very interesting? And so where are we now? We're now here. So US recognizes Venezuelan opposition leader as winner of contested election. Based on what? Based on what exactly? Based on an exit poll done by some American company that already has a pretty questionable reputation? Now, of course, I still don't know for sure what's been happening in Venezuela, but knowing all of this, ask yourself this question. Could it be possible? Is it conceivable that Nicolas Maduro actually won the elections fair and square, but that the United States government that has been supporting the opposition in Venezuela for years, that's been trying to get rid of Maduro for many years, simply made up a story of election fraud, trying to cause unrest in the country, which they succeeded in, by the way, hoping that they can use it to finally get rid of the Maduro government and replacing it with a government that happens to be much more sympathetic to US policies, so that big American corporations can swoop in and get their claws on the Venezuelan oil reserves. Could that be possible? Let me know what you think.